If you haven't subscribed yet, now's the time. When the channel reaches 1,000 subscribers, I'll share a surprise story I've prepared especially for you. The outpost sat on the edge of Apache and settler land. Nothing more than a scatter of cabins, a corral, and a militia post built from rough pine. The air smelled of sweat, horse dung, and wood smoke. The men stationed there lived with a constant unease, half drunk on whiskey, half drunk on fear of raids that might come with the night. The cowboy arrived near sundown, dust clinging to his coat, his hat brim pulled low. He was known as a man who carried his silence like a weapon. A scar ran along his jaw, the only outward sign of a violent past he never spoke of. He wasn't stationed there by choice. He had taken work as a scout, leading patrols along the dry creek beds, watching for Apache tracks, reporting back to men who cared more for blood than for peace. It was steady pay, but it left him with a bitter taste. He told himself it was survival, nothing more. Inside the post, laughter rolled too loud. Whiskey sloshed over tin cups. They slapped him on the back, praised him for his last patrol where he had guided them through a canyon and avoided an ambush. A man who knows his ground, one of them said. But their praise felt hollow. He hadn't forgotten the way one of the younger militiamen had boasted afterward about shooting an old Apache man who was too slow to flee. That memory sat heavy in his chest. Then they brought her out. The Apache woman was thin from weeks of captivity, wrists bound with rope, her dress torn at the hem. Dirt streaked her face, but her eyes burned clear and sharp. She couldn't have been older than 20, yet the set of her jaw told of loss far beyond her years. She had been taken from her people during a raid. He didn't know her name, and no one cared enough to ask. To the militia, she was a spoil of war, a trophy to be handed out. Your reward, one of them said with a grin, shoving her forward. The cowboy froze. He felt the whiskey burn in his throat, the weight of every eye in the room waiting for his reaction. She stumbled, then dropped to her knees and clung to his leg. The grip was desperate, her fingers tight, as if she knew the alternative was worse. The men laughed. Looks like she's chosen you, someone shouted. Take her, cowboy. She's yours now. His stomach turned. He looked down at her, not as a prize, but as a person cornered like an animal. Her breath came fast. Her shoulders shook, yet she refused to let go. In her eyes, there was both defiance and terror. His thoughts turned hard and fast. If he pushed her away, they would pass her to someone else, and he knew well enough what that would mean. If he accepted her, even unwillingly, he would carry the weight of owning another human being. He hated both choices, but standing still, saying nothing, felt worse. He crouched slightly, loosening the rope on her wrist with his knife. The room fell quiet at the gesture. She rubbed her raw skin, never taking her eyes off him, still holding onto his leg. He straightened, met the stares of the militia men, and spoke low. She comes with me. The words carried no pride, no sense of victory, only finality. The cabin they gave him creaked as he pushed the door open. Inside was a cot, a table, and little else. He set down his rifle against the wall and stepped aside. The woman hesitated at the threshold, eyes darting, body tense, but she entered. He cut the rope fully free and tossed it onto the table. He sat on the cot, staring at the floor, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He hadn't wanted this. He didn't want power over anyone. Yet when she had clung to his leg, trembling and refusing to let go, something inside him had shifted. Maybe pity, maybe guilt, maybe the smallest trace of responsibility. She sat near the fire pit, still watching him, waiting to see what kind of man he truly was. For the first time in months, he felt the silence inside a room heavier than the silence outside on the plains. The cabin smelled of old wood, smoke, and dust, and for a long while the only sound came from the crackle of a small fire he coaxed to life with dry twigs. He set the tin kettle near the flames, poured water into a cup, and slid it across the table toward her. She sat crouched near the hearth, shoulders tense, hands folded tightly in her lap. Her eyes darted to the cup, then back to him. She did not move. He spoke for the first time since bringing her inside. Drink. His voice was low, tired, carrying no force. It was not a command, just a plain offering. She studied him for a long moment, then rose slowly, her bare feet silent on the wooden floor. She picked up the cup, sniffed the water as if to test it, then drank. Her throat moved with quick swallows. He watched, his thoughts circling like dust in the wind. He had wondered if she spoke English. Some Apache women did, having been near trading posts or settlements. He asked, cautious, "Do you understand me?" Her eyes narrowed. She gave no answer. The silence stretched until the fire popped, breaking it. He let the question fall, not pressing further. He leaned back on the cot, resting his hat on his knee, staring at the cracks in the wall. His mind turned restless. Why had she clung to him? Was it fear, desperation, or calculation? He tried to push away the memory of the men's laughter, the way they had treated her like property, like spoils. It gnawed at him. He had spent years trying to live quiet, to make do as a scout and avoid the worst of men's cruelty. But even here, cruelty seemed to find him. She moved suddenly, startling him. She crouched by the rope he had tossed aside, picked it up, and held it in her hands. Her fingers traced the fibers, eyes distant. He saw the marks on her wrists more clearly now, red and raw. His stomach tightened. He cleared his throat, not sure what to say, then found himself speaking anyway. "You're free in here." He pointed to the rope. "That's done." Her gaze lifted to him, hard and doubtful, as if testing the weight of his words. She dropped the rope, then returned to the fire, sitting close, her back straight. The night stretched on. He lay on the cot, but did not sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, his thoughts returned to the militia. What would they expect of him now? If he refused their reward, they would hand her to someone else, and he knew what that meant. If he kept her, he risked trouble on both sides, from them, and from the Apache if they learned he sheltered one of their own. She did not sleep either. He noticed her eyes open in the dim firelight, fixed on the shadows at the door. Her hand hovered near the knife he had left on the table, fingers twitching as if she measured the distance, deciding whether to trust the space between them. By morning the air turned cold, the fire had burned low, and both sat as if waiting for something neither could name. He stood, stretched his back, and reached for the water bucket. "Creek's a quarter-mile east," he said, more to fill the silence than to teach her his routines. "I'll bring fresh water." As he stepped toward the door, she rose quickly, tense. He stopped, surprised. Her hands balled at her sides, her eyes fierce, and for the first time he understood. She feared he might leave her behind. He met her stare, then nodded once, calm, deliberate. "I'll come back." Her jaw tightened, but she did not speak. She sank back down by the hearth, though her eyes stayed locked on him until the door closed behind him. As he walked toward the creek, the morning sun climbing over the dry plains, his chest felt heavy with something unfamiliar. Responsibility. He hadn't asked for it, but it had settled on him like a weight. He wondered if he had the strength to carry it, and what it would cost him if he did. Inside the cabin, she sat with her back against the wall, listening to his footsteps fade, clutching the knife now in her lap. She would not let herself believe his promise yet. She had been taken once, betrayed once, stripped of everything once. But her body still remembered the choice she made the night before, to cling to his leg, to refuse the others. She did not understand why she had done it, but the truth sat sharp inside her. If she had not chosen, she would have had no choice at all. For now, she would wait. The sun was already high when he returned from the creek, the bucket of water heavy in his grip, the rifle slung across his back. His boots pressed into the dry soil, each step measured. He thought about her the whole way back, whether she had stayed, whether she had run, whether she had taken the knife and disappeared into the mesquite. A part of him almost hoped she had fled. It would free him from the questions circling in his chest. But another part of him, deeper and quieter, knew he didn't want to find the cabin empty. When he pushed open the door, she was still there. She sat cross-legged near the fire, the knife in her lap, the rope gone from sight. She had not fled. Her eyes locked on the bucket in his hands, then flicked to his face, sharp and watchful. He felt something ease in him. Not relief exactly, but a strange acknowledgement that she had chosen to remain. He set the bucket down, poured water into a cup, and drank first before handing it to her. He knew trust wasn't given easily, and so he made the gesture plain. She took the cup, her fingers brushing the rim where his had been, and drank. For the first time, her hand did not tremble. He noticed she had arranged the cabin differently while he was gone. The fire pit had been stacked with more wood, the small table cleared of dust, the blanket folded neatly in the corner. These weren't signs of comfort, but of control. She was marking space, shaping it into something she could endure. He respected that. They spent the morning in silence. He cut strips of rabbit meat from the night before, roasted them over the fire, and placed a portion near her. She studied the food, then ate without hesitation. He did not miss the way her eyes lingered on his every movement, where his hands rested, how he carried the knife, how far he stayed from her. Later, when he stepped outside to split firewood, she followed. Not close, always 10, 15 paces behind, but enough to watch. He felt her presence like a shadow. He swung the axe, the wood cracking clean, the rhythm steady. Sweat ran down his temples. When he paused to catch his breath, he glanced at her. She crouched near the cabin wall, knees drawn to her chest, scanning the tree line as if expecting danger. She wasn't watching him out of curiosity. She was watching because she still lived in fear of what could come. He asked, careful with the words, "Your people nearby?" It was the question that had sat unspoken since the night she clung to his leg. He had wondered whether the Apache might try to reclaim her, whether he was sitting on a fuse that could burn quick. She turned her head slowly, her face unreadable. Then she shook it once. No. The answer struck him harder than he expected. If she said no, it meant she had no one close enough to come for her, maybe no one left at all. The scarred men in the militia had hinted at what happened during the raid, but they never spoke details. He had seen the look in their eyes afterward, the kind of look men wore when they'd taken more than supplies, when they had left a trail of ash and bones behind them. His gut tightened. He lowered the axe, wiped his hands on his trousers. "I won't hand you back," he said quietly. The words felt strange in his mouth, a promise he hadn't planned to give. She stared at him a long moment, then stood and moved closer to the firewood pile. She bent, picked up a smaller branch, and carried it toward the cabin. No words, no nod, but the act itself was an answer. She was working beside him now, not just watching. As the afternoon dragged, they gathered water again. This time she walked beside him, not trailing behind. She carried a second bucket, though it was almost too heavy for her frame. He reached to take it, but she pulled back, shaking her head with a firm look. She would carry her share. He let her. At the creek, she crouched and filled the bucket, her hands steady. For a brief moment, he caught a glimpse of something beyond her grief, the discipline of someone who had done this 100 times before in another life, before the raid, before captivity. She wasn't helpless. She was surviving. When they returned to the cabin, dusk painted the horizon. He lit the lantern, trimmed the wick, and sat by the fire. She placed her blanket near the hearth again, but this time, she lay down on her side, her back not turned away but angled toward him, as if halfway between mistrust and acceptance. He stretched out on the cot, staring at the beams above. He thought of the choices that had brought him here, the patrols, the silence, the way he had stood in that post and said, "She comes with me." He wondered if he had saved her or only delayed something worse. Her breathing slowed, steady and calm. He closed his eyes, listening. For the first time since she arrived, the silence in the room did not feel like a weight pressing down. It felt like space they both allowed each other to keep breathing. And in that silence, he made a quiet decision. He would not let her be taken again. The days that followed pressed them into a routine that neither had planned but both accepted. At dawn, he would leave to check the creek or cut wood, and she would tend to the fire, sometimes stepping outside to gather kindling or berries from the brush. They spoke little, and when they did, it was only with simple words, short and measured. Yet each silence carried meaning, and each gesture slowly carved out a line of trust. He noticed how she always kept the knife within reach. At first, she slept with it in her hand, the blade tucked close to her chest. By the third night, it rested on the floor near her blanket, not clutched as tightly but never far. He respected that. He knew what it meant to sleep ready for danger, and he never asked her to put it away. What weighed heavier on him was the thought of the militia. They had been loud in their drunken boasting the night she was given to him, but men like that did not forget. He lay awake one night, wondering if they might come back, laughing and demanding her return. If they did, what would he do? He told himself he would stand his ground, but in the quiet dark he felt the unease of a man who had stood by in the past and let worse things happen. The memory of raids he had scouted, of blood on the canyon floor, clung to him. He had worked as a scout to survive, to earn pay, but survival came with a price, and guilt gnawed at him in the silence. She seemed to sense this conflict in him. One morning, as he sat sharpening his knife by the door, she approached the table and placed his boots beside the fire. They had been damp from the creek, and she had set them to dry without saying a word. When he looked up, her eyes met his briefly before darting away. It wasn't gratitude or warmth, but it was a sign. She was willing to do something for him, if only a small thing. He nodded once, a silent acknowledgement. The questions that had been left unanswered in the first nights still hung between them. Who was she before the raid? Did she have family still alive? Would her people come searching? He thought about asking, but each time he looked at her, he saw the weight in her expression and knew the answers would only deepen the pain. So instead, he learned by watching. When she walked near the creek, she scanned the horizon with the eyes of someone trained to survive. When she built the fire, she stacked the wood with skill, not clumsiness. These were not the movements of a helpless captive. They were the habits of a woman who had lived through hardship long before she crossed his path. One evening, as the sun bled low over the plains, he returned from checking the fence line with a rabbit in his hand. She was outside the cabin, sitting on a log, the knife in her lap. When she saw the rabbit, she stood, took it from him without hesitation, and began to skin it. Her hands were steady, her cuts precise. He watched, realizing she had done this many times before. The firelight caught her face as she worked, and for the first time he saw not just fear or grief, but a quiet determination. They ate in silence, but the silence was different now. It no longer felt like a wall. It felt like an agreement. He gave her food without condition. She prepared it without suspicion. That night, as the wind pressed against the shutters, he sat on the cot with his rifle across his knees. She lay near the fire, her back angled toward him but not fully turned away. He studied her for a long time, wondering if she believed him yet, wondering if she understood that he wasn't going to sell her, trade her, or hand her back. She shifted slightly under the blanket, eyes half open, and for the first time since she had been forced into his life, she spoke in halting English. "You stay." The word struck him. He swallowed, the firelight flickering across his scarred jaw. "I stay," he said firmly. Her eyes closed, her body easing just enough to show she had heard him. For him, the promise was heavier than he expected. Staying meant taking her side, even against his own kind if it came to that. It meant turning his back on the easy path of silence he had walked for too long. But he knew as he sat there, with the rifle resting across his knees, that it was the only choice left that would let him live with himself. And so the silence returned, not empty but full, the kind of silence that meant two people had decided, in their own way, to endure together. The weather had been dry for weeks, the kind of still air that carried dust instead of rain. But on the fifth night, the sky broke open. He had sensed it coming all afternoon. The way the wind picked up sharp and restless, the smell of rain thick on the air, the cattle shifting uneasy in the corral. By nightfall, the first drops struck the cabin roof, light at first, then pounding like stones. He rose from the cot, checking the shutters, sliding the wooden bar against the door. She had already pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders and crouched near the fire, eyes moving from him to the walls as the wood groaned under the weight of the storm. When a crack of thunder shook the ground, she flinched, her hands pressing to her ears for a brief moment before she steadied herself. He worked quickly, dragging the spare planks across the floor to brace the door. "Help me," he said, voice even but urgent. She didn't hesitate. She crossed the room, pressed her palms flat against the doorframe while he nailed the planks in place. Her hair clung wet to her face where the rain had blown in through the cracks. her breathing quick, but her hands did not tremble. For a moment, they stood shoulder to shoulder, the storm howling around them, holding the cabin together against the wind. When the worst of it passed, and the door held firm, they both sank back, chests rising and falling in sync. The storm still roared outside, but inside, there was only the crackle of the fire and the sound of their breathing. She sank onto the floor by the hearth, her knees drawn up, her eyes half closed from exhaustion. He pulled the blanket from his cot and set it gently around her shoulders. This time, she didn't push it away. He sat across from her, the fire casting sharp light across his scar. His thoughts pressed heavy. Memories of nights like this, sheltering with men he had ridden with, men who boasted of violence when the storm cleared. He looked at her now and knew he could not let the militia take her back. Not after she had stood beside him at the door. Not after she had shown him more courage in silence than most men did in their shouting. The storm raged on. She leaned into the blanket, her eyelids heavy. For the first time, he saw her body ease. Not completely, but enough to show she was letting go of her constant vigilance, if only for a moment. He sat awake long into the night, watching the shadows shift across the walls, the rifle across his lap. His mind circled the unanswered questions: who she had lost, how much she had endured, and whether she still believed she had a place left to return to. He realized she had not once asked for freedom, not once demanded to leave. Perhaps there was nothing left to return to. The thought cut deep, more than he cared to admit. Toward dawn, the storm weakened, the hammering rain turning to a soft drizzle. She stirred under the blanket, her eyes opening briefly. For the first time, she looked at him without hostility, without suspicion. There was still distance, still a line between them, but it was no longer drawn in anger. It was drawn in survival. He nodded once, as if answering an unspoken question, and turned his gaze back to the fire. She pulled the blanket tighter and closed her eyes again, her breathing steady. By the time the sun broke through the clouds the next morning, the cabin smelled of wet earth and smoke. The storm had left its mark, puddles on the dirt floor, damp wood, and a roof that would need patching. But it had also left something else, something unspoken between them. He felt in the quiet way she rose to gather wet branches for the fire, and in the way she no longer glanced at the door each time the wind shifted. The storm had not just tested the cabin. It had tested them, and though they hadn't spoken a word about it, both knew they had held it together. The morning after the storm carried a heaviness, as if the land itself was slow to shake off the weight of the rain. The soil outside the cabin had turned to mud, boots sinking half an inch with every step. He spent the early hours checking the roof for leaks, hauling damp planks from the shed, and patching what the storm had loosened. She worked quietly beside him, gathering fallen branches, stacking them to dry. Neither spoke, but their movements were no longer guarded. They worked as if they understood the rhythm of each other's silence. Inside, the cabin was damp but intact. She spread her blanket on the floor near the fire to dry it out, smoothing it carefully. He noticed how her eyes softened each time the flames caught, as if fire was the one thing that still tied her to the life she had lost. He didn't ask. He knew enough to understand that some memories didn't need words. Later that afternoon, while hauling logs from the shed, he felt the sharp tug of an old wound in his side. It had never healed right from a knife fight years back, a scar he carried with the same silence he carried everything else. The lifting tore it open again, blood seeping through his shirt. He dropped the log with a curse, pressing a hand against the wet patch. She was at his side before he could wave her off. Her eyes scanned the wound, sharp and steady. Without hesitation, she guided him inside, sat him down on the cot, and fetched a strip of cloth from her blanket. He stiffened when she pressed it to his side, but she didn't flinch. She cleaned the blood with water from the bucket, her hands firm but careful. He winced once, but he didn't pull away. Her expression stayed unreadable as she worked, though he noticed how her brow furrowed in concentration. She tied the cloth tight, then leaned back, studying him with the eyes of someone who had done this before. That, too, filled in a silence he had wondered about. She had tended wounds before, maybe to family, maybe to her people. She wasn't new to pain, or to the duty of care. When she finished, she set the bloody rag aside and sat back on her heels. Their eyes met. For the first time, there was no suspicion in her gaze, no defiance. Only recognition. The recognition of someone who saw weakness and didn't use it against him. He felt an unexpected swell in his chest. Not relief, not gratitude exactly, but something heavier, the weight of being seen as a man rather than a captor. The rest of the day passed quietly. She gathered berries from the thicket and brought them back, placing them on the table without a word. He mended a broken hinge on the door. When they ate that night, the silence no longer felt strained. She hummed softly as she cleaned the bowls, a sound almost too faint to notice, but steady enough to fill the cabin with something other than the crackle of fire. He lay on the cot later, staring at the roof beams, listening to her settle near the fire. She no longer clutched the knife as she had the first nights. It rested within reach, yes, but her hand no longer hovered over it. She curled under her blanket, her back turned only halfway, angled toward the fire and toward him. He noticed. His mind wandered back to the questions he had carried since the beginning. Did she want to leave? Did she still think of her people, of family she might have lost? Would she run if the chance came? The answers didn't matter in that moment. What mattered was that she had stayed. Not because of chains, not because of force, but because she had chosen to. He closed his eyes, the fire's glow flickering against the walls, and let that thought settle into him. For the first time since she had clung to his leg, the silence in the room carried something close to peace. The days after the storm bled into one another, steady and quiet, until the outpost itself broke that calm. At dawn, voices rose outside, harsh, drunken shouts, boots stomping on hard ground. He reached for his rifle instinctively. She stiffened where she sat near the fire, her hand flying to the knife. Through the cracks in the cabin wall, he saw them. 3 of the militiamen, the same ones who had handed her to him as if she were nothing more than a prize. They pounded on the door, laughing. "Cowboy, we've come for the girl," one called out, his words slurred with drink. "You've had your time. We'll take her now." His chest tightened. He had known this moment might come, had played it over in his head in the long silences of the night. But facing it now, with her eyes fixed on him, eyes that carried fear but also expectation, made the weight heavier. He rose, chambered around in the rifle, and stepped to the door. He opened it just enough to stand framed in the doorway, the rifle resting but ready. The men jeered at the sight, hands hovering over pistols. "She's not yours to keep," another shouted. "She's property." The word struck him like a blow. For a moment, old instincts tugged at him. The instinct to stay quiet, to step aside, to avoid conflict with his own kind. But behind him, in the cabin's dim light, he felt her presence, steady and waiting. She hadn't run, hadn't hidden. She stood straight, shoulders squared, no longer the trembling captive who had once clung to his leg. He spoke, his voice low but firm. "She's not leaving this cabin." The laughter faltered. One of them spat into the dirt. "You'll stand against us?" "For her." His hands tightened on the rifle. His heart beat hard, but his choice was already made. "I will." For a long, tense moment, the only sound was the wind brushing through the dry grass. Then one of the men cursed under his breath, muttered about it not being worth it, and turned back toward the outpost. The others followed, throwing threats over their shoulders, but their footsteps faded into the distance. He stayed at the door until the last voice was gone, then lowered the rifle. His breath escaped in a slow, shaky release. When he turned, she was still standing where she had been, knife in hand, eyes locked on him. Slowly, she set the knife down. He crossed the room, placing the rifle back against the wall. The silence between them now was different, not tense, not uncertain, but settled. She moved to the table, took the bread he had left there, and broke it in half. She handed him a piece. No words, no ceremony, just a simple gesture that said more than either of them needed to speak. They ate by the fire as dusk settled. She sat closer this time, not across the room, but beside him, their shoulders nearly touching. When she finished, she leaned back against the wall, her eyes softer, calmer. He looked at her, and saw not the captive forced on him by drunken men, not the stranger who had once eyed him with suspicion, but the woman who had chosen to stay. The questions that had lingered since the first night seemed to answer themselves in that moment. She had not left when she could have. She had not turned her back when he was wounded. She had not wavered when the militia came to the door. She had made her choice as much as he had. By the fire's glow, the cabin no longer felt like a place of waiting. It felt like shelter, a place where two lives, broken in different ways, had found a fragile but unshakable belonging. When the last light of day slipped over the horizon, she lay down near the fire, but not alone this time. She placed her blanket beside the cot, close enough that their breathing fell into rhythm. He rested back, eyes heavy, and let the quiet settle around them. For the first time in years, he felt no urge to leave, no need to run for what he carried. And for the first time since she had been dragged from her people, she slept without clutching the knife. The night held steady, and in that small cabin on the edge of the frontier, the story closed not with flight, not with loss, but with staying. And in staying, they found the closest thing to peace the frontier could offer.